Welcome to TradeTheMBI.com. This is John's Reports for the 21st, and well, we got all sorts of excitements taking place. Of course, you know, we've been looking at the weakness that was growing within the setup, the separation and the fall off of the shakeout were indicators that we were going to be retesting not only the NBM yellow, but below that you would then get to see a little bit more action. There wasn't any particular set level that we need to retrace to other than we'd already filled in these areas down below, so that isn't the most critical point. The shock for most people is why it hasn't fallen more and quicker given the expanding outbreak and things like that. And the easy answer is at the Fed. That's just the chart. The Fed is the answer, as long as they're providing this massive amount of liquidity. However, there's going to be a tipping point where the threshold of supply starts to diminish the ability for companies to earn money, and that will have much more significant economic impact. Not to mention, a growing fear aspect will be the greater threat than the actual disease, because if people become paranoid about being around other people, and that when you have consumer-based economies that require people to be feeling good about purchasing stuff, you've got a real problem if they're terrified to go out of their house, or if they're self-quarantining, or just avoiding, or hunkering down thinking there's going to be an all-out apocalypse. You know, they've been watching these movies for decades now of how disastrous everything will be, so naturally that's going to be people's only thought base of, you know, what to do and how to react to it. It's going to be counterintuitive, because there are going to be things that you would expect to break down and fall apart that aren't going to do that right away, and that's going to be the tricky play of it. We're going to have to literally watch closely with our indicators, because you're going to see when the big money starts to finally leave the scenario. So the euro, a disaster, but they're holding it as much as they possibly can at this particular spot. They really want to get back over this little blue line, because that's sort of kind of a tipping point for them, and you know, they've got to build up enough energy to get that to even out. And they've had a pretty extreme dip in the DOC red, so it's likely they're going to try and pop a little bit, but it won't be sustainable. It's going to come right back to it, because with cases growing in Europe, I know even in Italy, for some reason, allowed a Chinese man to come into the country, and he met with some of his friends who now have the virus, and that's exactly what the whole point of, you know, the air embargo and that kind of thing was supposed to help stop. But, you know, leave it to governments who want to pretend that things aren't what they are. We all knew this was going to get out. It was just a question of how quickly and how much time they would have to prepare, because that's really what's buying the most advantage, is the time that allows them to create emergency services and set up the infrastructure needed for disaster, you know, when you have significant numbers of people being sick. Now, so why is oil rising? Well, like I was saying before, governments stocking up strategic reserve, trying to get ahead of the curve on it, because when there are supply disruptions, because nobody is willing to be around anyone else, you are going to need to have a reserve of things. You know, it may sound paranoid, but I mean, even for me, we started adding to our canned good stocks and things like that, just a little bit, nothing dramatic, knowing that it's going to start increasing, because it's not going to be the illness per se, even though that's going to be bad enough for people my age, less so for my children, but the panic of disruption is going to be the significant element, and that is going to really impact the market. And that's why you're seeing gold go out of control, because the belief is that when all fiat currencies fail, the metals will be the only thing of value, as has been the story forever. So intraday was, the other day was kind of blah, and then all of a sudden we got to this little peak where we moved back up to falling DOC 100%, reached the low, and then boom, started cascading from there and built up. I wasn't expecting it to actually even make the upper move, because we didn't have a reset coming through here, but then it finally did reset steel. So I thought this was going to be a short-lived thing and was prepared to attack that more severely. Then we had that steel dip, and I was like, oh, okay. So even though we had the DOC spread, I was like, okay, I've got to watch for the positive move of the steel. Sure enough, the steel crossed, but we didn't quite have the other moves yet. The next bar, boom, they came in. Kind of stayed flat for a little bit. I thought with this rejection we might get it, but when that rejection happened, I would have expected steel to break down below it. Didn't do that, and that's what led to the breakout move to the upside there. And all we've done is filled that right back, and again, we're right at these same algo levels. You know, we came down for the low to this algo level. Once we got to it, held up support of it, broke up above it, and then boom, came right back down to it. It's all good action, so no complaints with that. We might start to see a little bit more follow through on some of the breakdowns, particularly as some traders get a little more spooked and think, I've got some serious gains, I might as well take some of it without getting a little crazy. And that's going to be the counterplay, because that's going to drive the market higher. As people see blood in the water, they think they can take advantage of one group. Even for a short period of time, they will. Because that's what sharks do. They take advantage. So keep that one in mind. Don't just expect, the headlines to create a parabolic fear in the market from that standpoint, because there still is so much liquidity out there that they could buy up everything that's being sold and then some with the amount of money they're being given. And they have a vested interest because a lot of them are extremely leveraged long and can't afford too big of a move in any one direction without causing, systemic shock. So that would be a whole nother area to cover. As always, though, I will put up any relevant charts. Trade well. We'll talk to you later.